This is the Mathematics Education Podcast from mathedpodcast.com. Welcome to the Math Ed Podcast. My name is Sam Otten from the University of Missouri, and my guest is Corey Webel, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Mathematical Sciences at Montclair State University. Thanks, Corey, for being here.
Thank you.
We're going to be discussing Corey's article entitled High School Students' Goals for Working Together in Mathematics Class, Mediating the Practical Rationality of Studenting. And that's going to be appearing soon in the journal Mathematical Thinking and Learning. But before we get to that article, I wanted to ask Corey if you could just describe your graduate experiences before your position at Montclair State University.
Sure. So I did my PhD at the University of Delaware, started in 2006 to 2010. Before that, I was a high school teacher. And I was using the Core Plus mathematics curriculum, and that was a really intriguing curriculum for me, and that was really what prompted me to want to go into math education and to study the different kinds of things that teachers do and the different things that students do when they're in mathematics classes.
Uh-huh. And your advisor at University of Delaware, I believe, was Amanda Jansen?
That's correct, yes.
And she's actually a past guest of this podcast. She's in episode 1205 if people are interested. So when you started your graduate studies, what did you see kind of as your main area of interest, or the area that ended up being, your dissertation?
Right. So I was really intrigued by, like I said, I was teaching from these Core Plus curriculum materials. Actually learned a lot of math by using those using those materials. And I was really interested in how teachers were using those. I knew that not everybody found those easy to use. There were challenges, and so I really started out by thinking, well, what's hard about this? What's hard about using this curriculum? And so I went to several different teachers' classes. I interviewed some teachers just kind of to see what they thought was hard, and I really became intrigued by this idea of promoting collaboration among students. I'm sure most folks are familiar with the way those curricula work, but there's a lot of group investigations where students are working together to solve problems.
Right.
And that was an aspect that seemed to be challenging for teachers to implement. So that's where I wanted to focus my dissertation.
Okay. And in your dissertation, so you're looking at the small group work and student collaboration, and you specifically were looking at students' perspectives. So you weren't just kind of studying them as an outsider. You were trying to get students' voices in that process.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually I did a pilot study where I was in 4 different teachers' classes. I was watching how the group work was enacted, how the students talked with each other, and I realized that I was trying to make some claims about how students perceived their experiences. I used a survey, but I realized the survey wasn't giving me enough in terms of how they were seeing their responsibilities. What were they supposed to do when they were asked to work together? And so I really wanted, for my dissertation, to get in their heads a little bit, and really my original goal was to try to understand how the decisions that the teacher made was impacting their sense of their responsibilities, and try to link up these instructional actions, instructional decisions with the way that the students were engaging in these collaborative group work sessions.
Right, investigating those links.
Yeah.
But for your dissertation, you ended up kind of as a building block to that larger potential research goal. You were, I think, it looks like you were first trying to really wrap your head around and get a framework and a way to really talk about students' goals for participating in the small group work and in the mathematical activities. Right.
So I expected them to talk more about the teacher and what the teacher was doing, but as I was talking to these students, they were bringing up all these other things, all these other motivations for the kinds of things that they did, and that was really intriguing. So the paper actually ended up taking a turn from where I thought it was going to go, but still really interesting. Really interesting data.
Yeah, and so I should say that this article that's going to be appearing in Mathematical Thinking and Learning, this article does come from your dissertation work, so it's right in this wheelhouse of students' goals for working together and working collaboratively in mathematics classrooms.
Right.
So one thing I wanted to ask you about in the article was you made an attempt, and I think a very good effort, and I try to do this in my own work as well, but it's to balance theoretically the social and the cognitive, or the social and the psychological. So could you talk a little bit about how you tried to achieve that in the article?
Right. I agree. I think that it's challenging. We think about learning from both of those perspectives, and I think that's a challenge for us to try to incorporate both of them. I still think that this particular article is pretty heavily from the psychological side. I'm talking to individual students about their perceptions, but I'm also trying to make room for the fact that some of the resources that they have, some of the goals, some of the things that they draw on don't necessarily just come in from their internal, assets, their knowledge or their beliefs. Some of those things come from the context in which they're participating. So in a classroom, I might be able to do things in one particular classroom that I couldn't do in another because the norms of that classroom legitimize that kind of action. And so I wanted to sort of try to account for that, at least in the theoretical framework, to say, that there are other things that are available besides just sort of your personal assets. There's these social resources I talk about in the paper that students can draw. So I wanted to acknowledge those, and I think there's a lot of room to do more of that. I think one thing that would have been a nice complement to what I did was to do more of a thorough analysis of the social norms of these kinds of assets as they were enacted in the class, sort of from this social perspective, to complement the focus that I took, which was mostly on the students' goals, perceptions of their responsibilities.
Right. But I think, even though this particular paper, it might still have more of a psychological slant, I think by setting the stage, you're allowing yourself in the future to really fill out both sides of it. And I think
so.
Setting that stage is important.
Yeah, I think so.
And you drew on Herbst's work with practical rationality to help you do that.
Yeah.
So having this research question about students' goals for working together in the classroom, so what was the particular data that you looked at to try to address this question about students' goals?
Just real quick, I want to say yes, drew on Pat Herbst's work, but also I had lots of conversations with Wendy Aaron, who's one of his students who's now at Oregon State. And so she helped me think about this from the student perspective. What are sort of the social goals, are the social resources available to students, whereas Herbst is mostly thinking about those resources from the teacher perspective. So I wanted to make sure I give Wendy some credit for that, because she helped me a lot with
absolutely.
thinking about that. So the data was mostly these interviews I did with the students. So I was doing these observations in the class. I spent pretty much a semester there. I did 23 observations for a 90-minute class, and then I interviewed. I picked eight target students, interviewed them a couple of times. During one of the interviews, I showed them clips. So I was making these recordings in their class, and a lot of times I was recording small group work. So I showed them these clips of themselves working in these groups and said, so here I noticed you did this. Tell me about what you were thinking, or tell me about why you think you did that, or what do you think of that? Do you think that was a good thing to do? So I really was trying to get at not only what they were doing, but what they thought about what they were doing, how they when they reflected on that, when they watched themselves, what kind of a reaction did they have? Really trying to sort of triangulate. It was interesting because when I would watch an episode, I would sometimes get this impression about what I thought the student was trying to do, and then you would talk to them, and you'd hear these discrepancies about what I thought they were trying to do, and then what they were really trying to do. So So it was really a nice methodology to really try to uncover.
It shows how important it is to really talk to the students or talk to the people involved and get their perspective on it. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that the viewing session was nice because it wasn't just let's talk about this in the abstract, because you never know. Here I am, this adult coming into this class, and they might want to say things that they think I want to hear. But if I can show them this video and say, well, look, you told me in my last interview that you like to do this kind of thing, but here in this video I see this, you're doing something different. So can you tell me about that? Tell me about why was this different, or is this a rare occurrence? Does this happen a lot? So it also I feel like it improves some of the reliability in terms of me making judgments about what was actually important to them.
And for these interviews, you refer to them as viewing session interviews. I wanted to just ask you, because in the article you talk about how this is different than stimulated recall interviews, which is maybe
Right.
what some of the listeners were thinking of when they hear that methodology, but could you just say a little bit about that choice to call them viewing session interviews?
Right. So there's a concern with viewing session interviews, with stimulated recall. This idea that if you're trying to get someone to watch this video and you say something like, "Well, tell me what you were thinking," in this moment, well, it may be hard for the person to remember what they were thinking, or they may make up some other motivation that sounds a little bit better than the one that they actually had. So there's reliability issues. So what I was really trying to do was not necessarily get them to recreate or reinterpret what they were thinking at the moment.
Okay.
But I was more focused on how do they think about the activity in the video now, sort of in reflection, in hindsight, as I look at this. How do I characterize what happened? Do I think what happened was good? Do I think it wasn't? So
Okay.
It's more about sort of using the video as a stimulus to reflect and to talk about sort of these more general goals, these more general motivations, rather than trying to recreate exactly how they felt at the moment.
Okay, so the setup is similar, but the focus is a little different. Instead of getting them to try to describe something from the past, what was going on in the video, you're just getting their reactions actually from the present. You're just saying, what are your reactions now? How would you describe your goals and your motivations and perceptions now?
Right. I mean, and there's some of that where they are sort of recreating what they thought, but it's really an analytical focus. That's not the central point of the analysis. Is not to try to, see what they were thinking at the moment, but more about sort of how they think about it when they reflect on it presently as they're talking about it in the interview.
And with your analysis, so you're looking for themes emerging for goals, and is it true that the dimensions that we're going to talk about in a second related to the students' goals for collaborating and working together, did those emerge, or did you have some sense of what those might be ahead of time?
They emerged. I was pretty open, and in fact, this particular paper is the way I'm talking about student goals was not my original slant that I was using for my dissertation. So actually, if you look at this paper compared to my dissertation, there's quite a few different. It's the same data, but it's this completely different lens of looking at it. So,
and that's because you were kind of letting the data speak to you, and you were trying to really go from the data.
Right. So again, I was trying to connect this, these student perspectives to the teacher's decisions, and I was asking them some about what the teacher was doing, but really what came out was these different goals that these students were actually seemed to be trying to achieve different things. When the teacher said, "Work together on this problem," different students were interpreting that very differently and thinking about what they were responsible to do very differently. So that actually was pretty surprising to me. And that comes out in the article and in the dimensions.
Okay, so now speaking of the dimensions, I'm just going to ask you to kind of describe what those dimensions were for the students' goals for working together in mathematics classrooms.
Sure. So the first dimension I think is kind of the familiar one. It's what are the goals? What is the content? What are the students trying to achieve when they're put into a group and their teacher says, work together on this problem. And I think you could separate those a lot of different ways. The way that I did in the paper was just a pretty simple mathematical goals versus non-mathematical goals. And so I illustrate that with this case of this kid that I call Logan, who just was fascinating. He's kind of the class clown of this particular class, and was very social, was very kind of boisterous, loved working in groups, but really interesting when I talked to him. I mean, we had this viewing session where his groups, not really getting much math done. He admitted, he's not learning much in the group, but he's kind of socializing and having this good time. And he's sort of, when I asked him about that, his characterization of the group work was that it was great. And he would even say, the teacher should put you in a group with your friends because you're going to get more work done, even though in the video he's not. So he's almost conflating getting work done or working well in a group with enjoying his time in a group. So for him, like, that was what it was all about. It was all about, is he going to enjoy this time to socialize? I mean, he's getting some work done too, but that's not really that's not really what his goal is when he's in a group.
Yeah. I mean, was he the student that said, I try to complete my work so that we can have more time to socialize?
Right. So he does talk about getting work done, but it's not about learning mathematics really. It's about getting these tasks done so that he can have some time to socialize and have a good time.
Mm-hmm. And so on the other end of that dimension would be mathematical goals for students working together.
Right. So there were other students who talked about really wanting to understand. I mean, there was one kid who said, Connor, who said he even contrasted sort of his group with other groups. He said, other groups, like, they go to the teacher and they want to get the answer, but I'd rather really understand this. I don't necessarily want to go to the teacher until I really, really need help. Otherwise, I'm going to really try to figure it out myself, because then our group's going to try to figure it out ourselves so that we really understand this thing. And so that was a pretty sharp contrast from what I saw from Logan. Mm-hmm. And again, that's just one way I think of characterizing the content of the goal. That's mathematical versus non-mathematical. I think you could characterize it in other ways, but I think that was pretty interesting just to see that variety within this single class.
Right. So. And I think the nice thing about the paper too is you present the cases where readers would be free to take a different interpretation as well. I mean, you make the case for your interpretation, but
sure,
you present the data and you sort of allow the reader to get to know the students in a way where they might also bring some of their own interpretations to it.
Right. That was one of my goals for sure, was to just put a lot of these students' voices in the paper so that people can see, the things that I saw when I talked to them. So.
Another dimension that you flesh out in the paper has to do with group versus individual. Could you say a little bit about that dimension?
Sure. So this one's not as much about what the content of the goal is, what I'm trying to achieve, but more about who's responsible for meeting this goal. Whose job is it to do this thing that I set up as my goal? So there were some contrasts here too. So I actually contrast two different students in Savanier and Connor are there. What I'm calling them. So Savanier is very concerned with. I mean, she's concerned with learning. She wants to learn the math. She's also concerned with getting tasks done. But for her, the responsibility for meeting those goals, for learning the mathematics, is mostly falls on the individual. So she says things like, if you don't want to do your work, that's your prerogative. You can. I'm not going to make you do your work. You can do it if you want. She says things like, if you want to copy my answers, you can copy my answers. It's your responsibility to make sure you understand. So it's really, for her, accomplishing this goal of learning mathematics is an individual thing. Everyone's responsible for their own learning, basically. And then if we go back to Connor again, he says things like, I don't think I should get too far ahead of the other members of my group. I think we should all be together. He actually mentions No Child Left Behind and says, I actually really like that because I don't think we should be leaving people behind. Yeah. He says things that, I think, I'm not really being successful unless we all are being successful. So he has this very much sort of this group responsibility. That solving mathematics problems, learning, is something we do as a class, is something we do as a group. So that was pretty interesting, again, to see both of those perspectives come out in the same class. I think it's an interesting way of sort of talking about differences in goals, not only in terms of what we're trying to do, but also who's responsible for doing these things, who's responsible for meeting these goals.
Right. And as we mentioned, there's a lot of data and a lot of the voice of the students in the article, and people would definitely be encouraged to look for the article. There's also a third dimension between the personal and the normative that you touch upon in the article, but it doesn't quite get as much attention as these first two dimensions do.
Yeah, and this one I think was hard analytically. It was hard to sort of describe, but it just popped out of the data where students would sometimes say something that seemed like it was a goal, but then later they would say, well, but that's not really. I don't really think that that's important, and so it was this idea that, like, there are these goals that are maybe more normative, that maybe they are, at least the students perceive as normative, that they're supposed to want to do this thing, but that when they really get down to it, that's not really one of their personal goals. So I think that's also an interesting, and I think it sort of leads into this idea of the social resources versus the psychological, sort of the personal resources. Like, here's my personal goal, but here's this goal that at least is perceived to be normative in the class, and then I think there's a negotiation that happens there. And so, like you said, I'm just touching on that in the article. This idea that there are these perceived normative goals that are sort of out there also, and I think that those are worth looking at.
And the article we're discussing is going to be appearing in the future in Mathematical Thinking and Learning. It's entitled High School Students' Goals for Working Together in Mathematics Class, Mediating the Practical Rationality of Studenting. I don't think we know what issue that's going to be published in yet, right? But it's going to be coming out probably in 2015.
I think it's January. I have,
really?
I have the proofs already, so it's soon.
Coming up soon. All right, great. My guest is Corey Webel from Montclair State University. I should say the award-winning writer Corey Webel. Corey won NCTM's Linking Research and Practice Outstanding Publication Award, and that's a great article as well that I would definitely encourage the listeners to read if they have a chance. But going back to the MTL article and with these students' goals for working together, having done this work, I mean, and you know, through your dissertation, but now also kind of reinterpreting it for this article, what do you see as compelling questions that are coming out of this work?
Sure. So my original purpose in exploring these students' goals was to really shed light on what it meant to teach in a class where you're going to use collaboration, and I think that's for me my personal interest in moving forward is to consider, okay, when I'm a teacher and I say, you know, students, let's work on this problem together, there might be much more diversity in terms of what students think that means.
Yeah.
Than you might realize, and I think that's really fascinating. And we think about diversity in a lot of different ways, but one thing that I'm not sure we think about is diversity in goals. What are these students' different goals for a practice, and not just working together? I think there's lots of practices you do. Wendy calls these studenting practices, which I really like. This idea of like there's teaching practices, but then there's these studenting practices too. And so when you ask students to engage in these various practices, they bring different goals with them, and I think that it's interesting to think about how those personal goals are negotiated in light of the norms that you want to establish, or norms that already exist, or again, this sort of negotiation between the personal and the social. I think is again another interesting question. But for me, it's this idea of sort of, okay, well, how can we help teachers? And that's sort of my focus.
Right. I mean,
ultimately is how do you help teachers enact these kind of practices successfully?
Yeah.
So I think for me, like, these goals they're leverage for teachers. Like, if I know that this kid really wants to work with his friends and feels like that's his main goal is to socialize. Well, okay, how can I think about that? How can I leverage that into him engaging in this collaborative work in the way that's going to be productive for him mathematically?
Yeah, and it's kind of coming back to your initial interest. Initially you wanted the teacher to be kind of in the picture, and you were interested as a researcher in the teacher's role in all of this.
Right.
And then now you needed to dig in to look at the students' goals and really get the student perspective, but now it sounds like you have kind of this motivation to pull it back out and look at the teacher again in relation to these issues.
Sure.
And I think, too, something that just struck me as you were talking about, a lot of times I think when teachers are talking about small groups, are talking about, collaboration in math class, a lot of time I think what's at the forefront of the teacher's mind is ability. You hear a lot about teachers doing ability groupings, or they're really thinking about my sort of high-achieving students and my struggling students and how am I going to group them. But now this work that you're doing is really bringing in another lens to that issue of it's not just about ability. There's also these social factors, and you might want to think about the goals that your students have when you are forming those small groups or when you're facilitating the small groups.
Right, absolutely. If you got a kid who just wants to get the answers and get through the tasks, and you're going to do this heterogeneous grouping where you're going to put him with a kid who's high ability, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
And that kid's probably just going to copy all the answers and think he's doing a good, he's meeting all of his goals.
And these differences that students might have in goals could be completely independent of the differences that they might have in their sort of abilities or their,
Sure, yeah.
My guest is Corey Webel, and I do have one more question I want to ask before I let you go. I appreciate you very much being here, but we're all curious, if you weren't in math education as a career, what could you see yourself doing?
So I have two answers to that question. I think of myself as a very right-brained person. So on one hand, I think I would do something that's totally totally non-math. So I actually I have this one of my guilty pleasures is I read fantasy novels. So I almost think I would want to be a writer, like a novelist who would write fantasy novels.
Yeah.
So that would be one goal. And then this other thing that I've always sort of thought, if I had a different life and got a chance to do it again, I may go in this direction, which would be architecture.
Oh.
Which I think is nice. I think it sort of blends this idea of you get to be creative, you get to do some artistic kind of things, but you're also using a lot of math, a lot of geometry. I've always been a geometry person. So that would be the other one. So maybe I'd be an architect and write on the side.
Yeah.
So.
That sounds great. Corey, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sam. Appreciate it.